Hello and welcome everyone. Meetings are probably the very often topic of many retrospectives, and maybe if you look attentively into what you hate most about your meetings, that will give you some interesting insights about your teamwork. That's something that I encountered when I stumbled upon the article on Serious Scrum about the format, retrospective format, which is called the Bad Meeting Retro, an article by our speaker, Paddy Corry, Agile coach at the Lean Agile Center of Excellence at ESW Dublin, and he will tell us more about it today. Welcome, Paddy. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to share screen and hopefully my Miro will behave. So thanks, Alex, for the welcome and thanks for the introduction. And hi, everybody. My name's Paddy and I'm an Agile coach. I'm talking to you from Dublin in Ireland here. And this talk and the article on which it's based is kind of a story, really. Represented by that black and white picture. I don't know if any of you know the movie 12 Angry Men, but I felt at times during this story that I was in a room with 12 angry men a lot of the time. So the origins of the Bad Meeting Retro game were to try and simulate that kind of experience and see what we could learn from it. But I'll explain more as we go along. So the subtitle there is Improving Meeting Effectiveness in an Agile Team. So my role, Agile coach or Scrum Master, depending on the context. I think, as Alex mentioned, meetings come up a lot when you're in an Agile team. How do we make them more effective? How do we make them less of a waste? So let's jump in. Just to start with introductions. I don't know why that's off a little bit. My name, as I mentioned, is Paddy. I'm from Dublin in Ireland. That's a picture of Dublin there. Doesn't look like it's 37 degrees in that picture. I think it's a nice evening shot there. I'm an Agile coach by trade. I write for a Medium publication called Serious Scrum. Lots of really good content there, so encourage you to have a look. I'm going to share some links to posts that I've written, but there's a number of really, really great writers and editors there on all kinds of topics, not just specific to Scrum Mastery to do with product, all kinds of topics. So really encourage you to take a look. And I'm also a meetup facilitator myself, so I love these kind of events. I'm looking forward to hopefully some chat when I'm finished telling the story here and to hear from your experiences too. So that's me. I'm hoping to do just a very quick check-in before we kick off. And I know some people have already done this already, but we'll try and add a sense of drama to this if we can. So in the Zoom chat, if you haven't, or even if you have done this already, please type in where you are in the world and what time it is, just because that's of interest to me. I just want to know what time it is for everyone. We'll count down 3, 2, 1. Go for it. So we've got London, Munich, Cape Town, Edinburgh, Montreal, Aachen, Berlin, Copenhagen. Have we even got 2 people in the same country? This is quite an international group. Did I see 2 Edinburghs? John and Lumi. Yeah, so 2 in Edinburgh. We have 2 in London, 2 in Berlin, Frankfurt. Amazing. So quite an international group, isn't it? Well, great to see everybody here. And look, I hope this story has something for you, regardless of where you're from and what time it is. Some of you are closer to dinner time than others, so we'll try and get a move on. So I'm actually just going to come out of the presentation for a moment here, because all the slides appear to be going up. So about this talk, it's about meetings and Agile team facilitation, and it's about a story of things going wrong and some learning that I went through to try and put things right. It's about facilitation skills, how to develop them, and just sharing some tips that I picked up along the way. But it's also about participants too, and how to participate in meetings. And that's where the bad meeting game came about. There's actually two versions of this that I can share with you as well. So before we begin, I might just use the chat here. Are there any questions anyone has before we kick off? Anything that you would like to know before we get started? So you can use the chat, just enter anything that you're curious about before we start. If there's nothing, it's absolutely no problem. But if there's anything, we can take a moment now.
And once you have a question, then feel free to post it anytime in the chat. And I will ask some questions during the presentations, and we will address all the questions during the discussion.
Right, so Amy's asking, will a friend as a facilitator ever be happy with their performance? Interesting question. Yeah, we might come back to that towards the end. So this is, I guess, part of the origin story of this talk. I'm going to introduce a story about, I guess, a kind of a facilitation challenge, and that's where this really kicked off. Allow me to jump in, and I'll come back to the questions in a moment. So my definition of meeting here comes from User Story Mapping, Jeff Patton's awesome book, which is worth rereading, even if you have read it at some point. And I think this definition of meeting is sometimes a word thrown at a Scrum Master or an Agile coach. It's the euphemism we use for unproductive collaboration. So when something's not going well, it's a meeting. If we're working well together, it won't feel like a meeting. And I just love this definition, because when we feel like we're in a meeting, we're probably already on the wrong track. My story is about a bad meeting. It's a bad daily stand-up, which had a pre-part and a post-part, because, well, we had a very difficult context. We had a powerful client, lots of priority changes, lots of production issues, a very kind of volatile situation. So we needed time before our daily stand-up, and we needed time after it. A lot of discussion, a lot of conflict, really. And my experience in that was to try and figure out, how would I do things better as a facilitator? That's what I took away initially. It was, how can I facilitate this in a better way? And that led me to try and learn more about facilitation as a skill. So, for example, what could I do differently as a facilitator? I thought I needed to go and just learn a bit more about the basics. But what is facilitation? How can I define facilitation? And I like this definition from IC Agile. This is from the Agile Team Facilitation course, Learning Outcomes. And facilitation is helping a group identify common objectives, offering group processes to achieve those outcomes while maintaining neutrality. I really like that. There's an element of servant leadership here. You can tell this definition is in an Agile context, right? We're working with a group to identify objectives that we have in common and offering ways to help achieve those while maintaining neutrality. So a lot of challenges here for someone in a facilitator role, particularly if you're a team member. And that helps move towards a definition of Agile team facilitation. So we can be a neutral facilitator, but when we're in an Agile team, we're helping an Agile team achieve common objectives. So how do we have an efficient or effective daily stand-up? How do we have an effective planning or refinement session? And we're offering processes to help those achieve those outcomes with an inherent bias towards Agile practices. And I'm seeing a reference to retros, repetitive retro formats, or facilitating retros with teams that aren't particularly talkative. Yeah, we're always on the lookout for ways to help Agile teams achieve these objectives, right? The objectives we need to get to with an inherent bias towards practices that come from an Agile context. And as I learned more about Agile team facilitation, I have taken this IC Agile team facilitation training, and it's really strongly recommended. I think it's great. I started writing a little bit more about what it means to be a facilitator in an Agile team. And writing is a good way for me to reinforce learning. And in the context of Serious Scrum, this publication, it's everything you write is peer reviewed. So you're in the process of writing before publishing, you're sharing what your thoughts are with other peers, other professionals, and they're kind of asking you questions, probing a little bit, reviewing your thoughts. And it really helps make things more concrete. So when I wrote this post, I zoned in on a few things that I thought were important in any meeting that needed a facilitator. And I think I've noticed these more and more as time goes on, that when I attend meetings that don't have facilitation, it's like good design. You notice the absence of it very quickly. So, for example, preparation, knowing who the right people to attend are, and making sure that everybody can use the tools if you're on a remote call, or if it's a hybrid or in-person call, that the environment is set up correctly. I got feedback early on in my Scrum Master career that I was often facilitating like a participant. And that was a learning point for me, that facilitating with a leaning towards neutrality to help the group achieve the outcomes was something I needed to learn and I needed to make a movement on. It's also in the role of the facilitator, there are competencies that you might associate with coaching as well. So listening, active listening, reflecting back to the group what's being said. And what some people might think is a low value stance, but can actually be valuable, especially in a remote meeting when you're using a collaborative whiteboard, using Scribe or playing the Scribe role, keeping track of what's being discussed. It can add value in a meeting. Also, timekeeping. I think people who work in Agile teams, you'll know, teammates are very sensitive towards time management. Being late is a big no-no. Finishing late is probably even worse. So keeping to time boxes. And also that nuanced point of, if we're nearly done, but we're going to go 5 or 10 minutes above the time box, can we flex a little bit, or are we really going to stick to that time box? So understanding when that conversation can happen, which groups will accept it, which groups won't, maybe making the invitation 5 minutes before the end of the meeting, like we're getting close, but we might run over. Can everybody stay on? Or do we say, no, we stick to the time box always? And then involvement, as people are discussing in the chat here, how do we engage with people? How do we encourage people to maybe not even use their voice, but be involved in the meeting? And in remote meetings, particularly even a context like this, cameras off is okay. Just using chat is fine. So how do we discuss engagement in that kind of context? And in a work professional context, what's okay in the context of a team meeting, in the context of a refinement workshop? How do we encourage participation in the right ways? And now that we're moving back into a hybrid environment again, with remote and people who are located in an office, working together, that involvement can even be more challenging. And then wrapping up, I often find with meetings that are lacking in focus, you get to the end of the meeting and someone says, well, that's it, we'll close there. And you find yourself thinking, well, what was the point? I mean, what's happening next? Is there any follow-up? Did we actually achieve what we thought we would? So feedback loops as well, really important part of facilitation. So there's a lot here. And this isn't covering everything. This was just the learning points that I found I was hitting. Facilitation is a broad set of competencies. So facilitation was one area of learning for me as I thought about my bad meeting and how to improve it. And on the IC Agile Agile Team Facilitation course, I was introduced to something that really helped me tackle facilitation in a structured way. This might seem like a small thing, but it's made a big difference to me in how I prepare for one-off workshops, regular meetings with teams, how to just get my head into that preparation. This is the facilitation canvas it came from a company called Nomad 8, where you can fill in the boxes sequentially, whatever order you want, but you're thinking about what is the purpose of the meeting that I'm about to have? Who are the people that are attending? And in thinking about who's attending, you're thinking also about, well, what might they need? What inputs need to be prepared? What do I need to prepare? Or what do I need to ask other people to prepare? What's the agenda? So is there a one-off meeting that I need to think about a date and time? Or is it a regular meeting that we need to stick to a time box? And how am I going to set the agenda there? The environment can be the location, the call, the tools we're using if it's fully remote. And here's where it gets important. What outcomes do I want to get from the meeting? What outputs do we need to have at the end of the call? But what outcomes, what intangible things are we trying to generate with this meeting? And what possible pitfalls could come up in scheduling or running it? So if you're thinking about a daily stand-up here, you could prepare this facilitation canvas and even show it at the start of the meeting and say, look, just to illustrate the purpose of the daily scrum, here's what it's for. Here's who's attending. The inputs are, our team board. Here's our agenda, how we've agreed we're going to run it, the outcomes we're trying to get to, and the outputs that we're going to achieve in each call, in each meeting are X, Y, Z. So I've used this to help prepare for meetings and also to introduce them at the start. And just to show you that I'm not just making this up, here's an example of a facilitation canvas that I drew up for this talk. So you can see here the purpose or the goal of this talk is to hopefully help improve meetings in an Agile team. And I've kind of just brainstormed a little bit on the agenda, what the topics that I'd like to cover in the talk. I know it's going to be a remote call. The outcomes hopefully will be better understanding of retrospective facilitation and some retrospective formats that might be able to help the people who are here. So this canvas has been one thing that's made a big difference to my facilitation. But I think when you're dealing with bad meetings, it's not all on the facilitator's shoulders. And that's why, a question that came up was like, well, what about bad behavior? What about people who are perhaps not participating in meetings in the right ways? How do I deal with that? Because conflict is positive sometimes, of course, but when it bleeds over into that negative space, or when there are, the bad behaviors in meetings, we'll get to the specific ones, but I'm sure you're familiar with them. How to tackle that. And I was reminded about a meetup that was hosted in the meetup group that I run myself, and an Agile coach from UK called Nigel Baker introduced this idea, which has stayed with me. I really like it. It's the idea that you can evaluate practices in the context of a team, and you can evaluate them over time. So core practices are the practices that are just non-negotiable. We're always going to do these core practices. Good practices are things that are good for my team here, but they might not be good for your team. You might have to just figure it out. You might just have to try and see, does it work for you? And bad practices are, well, they're objectively pretty bad. So over time, bad practices will probably not become good. That's pretty unlikely, but good practices can become bad and become outdated. And the example that I like to illustrate this is retrospective formats, that the retro itself is a core practice, non-negotiable. We're not going to get rid of the retrospective. I'm not a Scrum fundamentalist or evangelist, but if you're in a Scrum team retrospectives are unquestionably a core practice. However, the formats that we use, the retrospective formats that we use each time, they age quickly and they age badly. So they can go from good, in fact, the arrow should probably really start in good. They can go from good to bad pretty quickly. They can get quite dull, get quite old. So this implies that in a retrospective, we can think about switching it up, and we don't have to stay with the same retrospective format. And this was kind of a freeing thought for me. This was a point of learning. And I began to think about different ways I could mess around or tailor retrospective formats to suit the team that I was working with at the time. And I was trying to think of things that would be important to them. So I discovered a format online and tailored it a little bit to make a retrospective format that would emphasize control. So it's pretty much what's going well and what's not going well, except with a second axis. So of the things that are going well and of the things that are not going well, which of these are under our control and which of these are outside our control? So when we come up with ideas for things that are going well and not going well, we can put them on the high or low part of the 2x2 matrix here. But then the question is, okay, for something that's not going well, can we fix it? Or do we need help from outside the team? And this is a nice question because you're holding a neutral stance. You're helping the team achieve an objective of a retrospective, which is to discover improvements. But also, there's a tacit question here of, do we really have to escalate these? Like, can we actually deal with it ourselves? And there's a lot of respect there in that question, and also a little bit of challenge, I think. And the flip side of it is also quite nice. For things that are going well, if it was outside of our control and it went well, couldn't we thank people? You know, and for things that are going well under our control, keep doing those. That's great. So we get a chance to celebrate success and also think about moving items that might be over here over to this side. So if things are ending up in this part of the matrix, the 2x2 matrix, we might ask, well, what could we do to bring these more under our control? Is there anything we could do, or are we just stuck? So this became a retro format that I occasionally used, not every time, but I think the experiment of trying a retro format that was coming from my own, an adapted version of one I saw online, was really empowering. So I got the confidence to keep going. It led to this one, the Bad Meeting Retro. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more now. I started reading a little bit about an idea called liberating structures. I don't know if you've seen them. They're really nice components of a meeting, if you like. So you can run a 5-10 minute part of a meeting with one liberating structure, and then move into another one, and then move into another one. So one of the ones that I really like is called Triz, where you might ask a question that's negative. It's sometimes called a pre-mortem, like how could we make this project fail? And the question is designed to tease out, well, we could have bad working relationships, like we could not show up to meetings, we could behave badly in we can start thinking about, well, what are the destructive behaviors? And the next question is, well, how do we avoid them? So strings of pieces of a meeting is where I was coming from with this idea that we want to look at what makes meetings terrible first, but the goal is really constructive. It's to figure out, well, how could we avoid that destructive behavior, help our meetings work better, and then what experiment could we try to improve our meetings? So this is what the game is about. And I call it a game because it was designed to be a little bit of fun, not too serious. And it's really about getting a team to participate in a simulation of a terrible meeting. That's the idea. There's a bunch of cards which correspond to a role, and you can have, well, you need a facilitator, someone to play the facilitator role. You can have up to, I think I have 6 participants and two observers. So the facilitator is kind of in the middle of things. The participants all have different roles and a character sheet, and the observers are keeping track of what's going on. So to set up the game takes about 5-10 minutes. Everybody just gets given a card. We nominate a facilitator. Typically, it's someone who doesn't usually facilitate because they get an experience of what it's like to be in the middle of a bad meeting. And the observers are asked to keep an eye on the behaviors that are constructive and the behaviors that are destructive. So this is about the actual retrospective facilitator setting the scene. In the bad meeting, there are 6 roles. One person pretends or acts like the whole meeting is a waste of time. One person is an interrupter. So anytime someone else speaks, they talk over them. One person will arrive late and ask for a recap. One person is supportive and helping the facilitator. They just want to get to the goal. They're trying to be constructive. But then there's also one person who wants to actually lead the meeting themselves, and another person who disagrees with everything anybody says. And the facilitator's goal is to try and schedule a workshop. That's the goal that the facilitator is trying to get to. Anytime I've run this, I haven't seen the facilitator achieve the goal. So the goal is not for the facilitator to achieve their goal. The goal is just to watch the chaos unfold and, sympathize, empathize with the poor facilitator as they deal with all these bad behaviors with one supporter in their midst. So it's about bad acting, a little bit of fun. As a facilitator outside the bad meeting, the job is to just watch out for any behaviors that overact a little bit too much. Keep it, so it's not melodramatic, that it's just a little bit of fun. But it is, anytime I run it, it has been fun. I've run it in the place where I've worked, and I've run it in a meetup. People who didn't know each other, and they actually had even more fun. They were going pretty wild with the acting. It was good crack. As we say in Dublin, good fun. But when you're finished, right, the chances are the facilitator will not achieve the goal. So that's okay. Now it's about the feedback. So what did the observers notice? Who was doing what? Remember, the observers haven't seen the cards that you've given to the participants, so they don't know that they've got specific instructions. Then it's about asking the participants, how did it feel? How was the experience? And you can categorize the feedback, destructive behaviors, constructive behaviors. So it's about both sides. Who was being destructive? What did you see or hear? Who was being constructive? What did you see or hear? And then ask the facilitator about the experience. How did it feel? And for people who don't normally facilitate, I think there's usually a sense of empathy or sympathy for the facilitator after playing the role in a game like this. And these sources of feedback help you then have a conversation about, as a team, is there anything we could do to avoid bad meetings or bad behaviors in meetings like these? And what I've found when I've run this game is it usually leads to a bit of openness and a bit of candor, because we've had a little bit of a laugh together, and it kind of takes the seriousness or takes the conflict out of the bad behaviors in meetings, and we can actually just talk about it without fear of more conflict. It's actually a light context to discuss these things, and then we can vote on an improvement item to help. And usually this is about discussing norms, things that the team can do, and start maybe referring to with each other, rather than needing somebody like a facilitator to act like a policeman or a corrector of bad behavior, which is not a stance I was very comfortable with. So the debrief here is really where the improvements come from. and hopefully where the discussion will be interesting. There's also a bad remote meeting retro. These two games were actually both written before the pandemic. So the bad remote meeting retro is actually a hybrid meeting. And this involves the same idea, the same kind of principle that we've got a bunch of people participating in a meeting. We're trying to get to a goal, and the facilitator has a very difficult challenge. But in this one, the facilitator has the goal of refining a user story. So there's an extra card here which describes the user story. Everybody has that. We've got a product owner, a scrum master acting as facilitator, and a development team trying to get that user story refined. Now, the behaviors in this game are a little bit tailored to bad behaviors that I may or may not have observed in refinements over my years as a scrum master, but there is one supportive participant in this meeting as well to help the facilitator. Our product owner is usually the star of the show here. That's why I've put the product owner character sheet on the image here. You can see he's got 2 pages of a character sheet, so he's got a few behaviors to demonstrate. Typically, it's about impatience with the scrum master or the facilitator involving the remote participants in the call. So the PO and the scrum master are in an office together and people are joining the call. We've got someone else in the office who is complaining about the tools we're using. So she just wants to use a different tool, doesn't understand why the scrum master can't arrange for the team to use a different tool. We've got one person on the call who's really important to get the user story refined, but has the camera off and the mic on mute, and we're not really sure if he's there. He does join in eventually. We've got another developer who has to leave early, also very important to get the story refined. We've got another person on the call who can't hear anyone, and another person who has background noise all the time. And we encourage creativity of the person who has background noise. Sometimes it's a dog barking, sometimes it's an airport. It can be kind of fun. But with this one, I worked with an Agile coach here in Dublin, Coca, to put together some facilitation and participation tips. And we've included those in the link there. And I saw a question about asking whether we could have the slides afterwards. Yes, I'll share the slides after with Alex, so you'll have access to all of these links and everything. So this game, it's the same kind of structure. We host the meeting, we ask for feedback from the facilitator, the observers, the participants, and we try and brainstorm ideas for improvement again. But the additional cards are a bit more support for facilitator and participants. So just general good advice, good meeting etiquette, which can come up, when you're having retrospectives on these kind of topics. So I'm nearly at the end of the story here, and I think we're about to move into some Q&A, and I'm really curious to hear, your stories of bad meetings, facilitation, retrospective formats, and if there's any topics from the questions that we haven't covered yet, I'm more than happy to have a chat. But the key points that I'm trying to bring in this talk are that quote from Jeff Patton: "Meeting is a euphemism." If we're talking about a meeting, we may be having unproductive collaboration. Bad meetings can be improved with better facilitation, but if you're in a team and these are regular meetings, team coaching can help an Agile team take more control of their destiny. And that can include how they show up, how they participate with each other in meetings. Because the unproductive collaboration, it's not always the fault of the name of the meeting. It can be down to facilitation if a meeting is unproductive, but it can also be down to participants' behaviors too. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Retrospective formats are good, but they can go bad over time. So having retrospective formats that work in context for your team is a good thing. And all of the formats that I'm showing to you here were tailored for something in mind that I saw as a Scrum Master with working with a team. I didn't kind of just pick them off the shelf. I actually thought, okay, this would be a helpful retro format because of the team I'm working with. Just a couple of notes of caution. Not everybody likes games. If you've ever tried any games in your team before, you'll know not everybody's 100% comfortable. So that's where the observer roles come in. I think there's a nice, it's almost like an option to pass. If someone's really not comfortable participating in the game, obviously the option to pass is still there, but the observer is perhaps a bit of a compromise role. And another note of caution as well, retrospectives without improvements, without that voted idea for improving things, can turn participants off pretty quickly too. So if there is a way to gauge success as a facilitator in a retrospective, I think it is, did we get that improvement item out, or did we do more than just have a little bit of fun, talk about bad meetings? You know, what is the one thing that we're going to do differently next time? Those would be the key points that I'd like to bring. So I think at this stage, Alex, I have a way for us to share a link to the board where I could ask for questions, comments, or a little bit of a drag and drop dot vote for feedback. So I can share that link in the chat. And
Awesome.
At this stage, more than happy to open up for any questions that there might be.
Let's do that. Thank you very much, Paddy, for all the insights and tools shared. Let's switch off the recording and move on to the discussion.